Well, welcome. We're just waiting a few minutes while people populate into the webinar right now. Good evening and welcome to Putting Your Garden to Bed, presented by the Central Oregon Master Gardeners and Oregon State University. My name is Janet Dart and I will be your host. Master Gardeners Joanne Abbott and Pat Colling will give a short presentation, and then they, along with Chris Meow, will answer any questions. Master Gardeners Vicki Miner and Jennifer Komisky will be assisting me in directing questions to Joanne, Pat, and Chris. But first, some housekeeping for our webinar. All videos and microphones are off except for the presenters. If you have questions as we go along, please type them in the Q&A window, which you can find on the bottom of your screen. Because of the number of attendees, we will not be able to recognize raised hands, so please just use the Q&A. We'll answer all your questions after the presentation. If you have the same question as someone else, please click on the thumbs up icon next to the question instead of asking it again, and that will move it to the top of the queue. When the webinar is over, you'll receive a short survey. We hope you'll take a moment to fill it out. And lastly, at the end of the presentation, Pat will show you 2 pages of helpful links. No need to write these down. We'll send them to you along with a link to the copy of this webinar in a follow-up email. And that's it for housekeeping. Before we get started with the presentation, we'd like to know a little bit about our audience. Please help us by participating in a short poll. Looks like we're there. Do you want to share the results, Vicki? So it looks like most people have both vegetable and perennial gardens, which isn't a surprise. And interesting, it's higher on the perennial than the vegetable. And we've got people that have gardened here for 1 to 5 years. Let's see them. I'm missing part of my screen. A lot of greater than 5 years and a lot of newcomers. So that should help our presenters. So with that, I am going to turn this over to Master Gardeners Joanne Abbott and Pat Colling. There we go.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight. The goal of our presentation is to talk about the basics for vegetable gardeners, have good gardening practices, rejuvenation, and lay the seeds for next year's total success and planning for spring.
In addition, we are also going to talk about preparing your landscape plants for the next seasons. That includes fall planting, things that you can do now, cleaning up your garden, building the soil for your perennial and landscape garden, as well as what to do to protect your gardens for our winters.
So we're going to start with vegetable gardens in the fall. And this first bullet point kind of sets it because the title of this is Putting Your Garden to Bed. But before I get into that, it's kind of a bittersweet time of year, isn't it? We've been working in our gardens for months and now we have to put them to bed. So the first thing we really need to do is harvest the remaining vegetables. First things first, you need to be gentle. No bruising of anything that you're harvesting now, because that will equal early decay. Use clippers to remove your vegetables. Don't try to just rip them off the vine. You need to be gentle. You don't want any bruising. Your root crops like carrots or potatoes or beets, make sure your shovel or your spade is well away from the vegetable or the root itself, so the spade doesn't actually hit the root. You want to be able to knock that soil off so it doesn't bruise the root. A big thing around here is, what do I do with all my green tomatoes? Even today, as I was going through my list here, I'm going, what about my tomatoes? Mine are still on the vine, and tonight is actually going to be rather cool. So hopefully it's not too late for all of you to get out tomorrow to get those green tomatoes off of your vines. There's plenty there. And there's ways that you can evaluate whether or not those tomatoes will ripen off the vine. Look at the color. If you've got a light pink or just some sort of color on the tomato, they might ripen off the vine. If they don't have a color, if they have kind of a translucent kind of color to them, those might ripen off the vine. If you don't see any of that, well, more than likely they won't ripen. But here's a couple of examples from my tomatoes. These I picked today, just this afternoon. And I don't know if you can see, the light may be too bad, but see there's sort of a pinkish color to this one for sure, and just a very light pinkish color to this one. These, if I don't bruise them while I'm carrying them around, they will probably ripen. Here's another one. This is an heirloom, and it is entirely green, but there's a translucency to the bottom of it, sort of a clear thing, clear color. This will probably ripen. It will take longer, but it can ripen. The other ways you can tell is if you want to take one of your tomatoes, cut it in half, and look at the meat inside and where the seeds are. If the seeds are kind of in a gelatinous kind of material or sticky material, that means that that tomato probably will ripen. If you cut it in half and it's hard all the way through, more than likely that won't ripen. So instead of trying to ripen those, you can do other things with that, which I'll list in just a few minutes. So for those that you think will ripen, what you need to do is get a shallow box, put some newspaper in the bottom, and cut your tomatoes so that you've got a little bit of a nib on the top. Don't take this total off, this top off, because that leaves an open area for disease to actually occur. Put those tomatoes in a box, not touching each other, and make sure you put them labeled so you know which tomatoes are which. Put them in a box with newspaper separated, and the room temperature should be between 55 and 70 degrees, and they will ripen on their own. There's no need for a window. They will ripen because of the temperature in the room. The warmer the temperature, the quicker they will ripen. But you should check them every week, at least, if not earlier, to make sure that if any are starting to rot, you move those out of the box, because you don't want to transfer any of those molds or whatever bacteria to the other tomatoes. So it could take between 2 to 4 weeks, depending again upon the temperature of your room. If you have a lot of green tomatoes, as I said, that won't ripen, you're pretty sure, 3 recipes that I can come up with are green tomato chutney, fried green tomatoes, or green tomato pie. So you can find those recipes online. And I actually just cut my tomatoes off the vine this afternoon. We'll see what happens. Extending your season if possible. So if you're not gardening in a community garden that has a closing date, and you can extend your season for however long, there are things that you can do to keep your vegetables going in your garden. One thing is row cover. Many of you, because many of you are seasoned gardeners, you know about row cover. This is a very thin film of material that you can throw over your plants and cover them, and it will keep the temperature a couple degrees above the outside air. Another thing that I have used is what you see in the middle picture of this slide, and it is called a row. I keep forgetting, it's called a row shelter. I use this in the spring when I'm starting my starts in the garden. They work really well because it allows water to get through with overhead sprinkling. Later I will explain how I'm using that for this winter and this fall. And on the right side is a cold frame. A cold frame is built of obvious wood and maybe windows, anything that the sunlight can get through. And you can find materials for this at any, like a restore or a building supply store. Use old windows that are trying to be resold. You can put that right in your garden. You can put it on your deck or your patio. The thing to remember is that if it's a warm winter day, then you need to open those windows so that you don't burn and overheat the vegetables that you've got in that cold frame. There are some really good sites to look at as far as building cold frames online too. So then we go to, gathering herbs for drying. Herbs are really most flavorful if you cut them before they bloom. So now is probably a little late for that great flavor, but you can still do it. You can freeze them, you can dry the herbs. And the thing with biennial or perennial herbs, you can bring them indoors so that you can enjoy them throughout the winter season. But before you do that and you put them in a pot, or if you're using the pot that you had all summer long, make sure you check for pests. You don't want any pests to be introduced inside your house. So, what seeds do you want to save for next year? And what seeds can be saved? The first thing you really need to look at your vegetables, your plants are, what did I really like? What do I want to grow that I grew this year that turned out well? And do I want to save the seeds from that plant? Well, the really best thing for you to do is to understand whether or not that plant was a hybrid or was it an heirloom or open pollinated plant. And you would know that by looking at the seed packet or the plant stake that was in the plant when you bought it from one of the stores. It will tell you whether or not it's a hybrid or if it's an heirloom. A hybrid was developed due to the outstanding characteristics of two different varieties, such as color of the vegetable, flavor, the disease resistance or hardiness. So the scientists brought these two varieties together and it makes a wonderful vegetable. So basically you brought two different parts together to make a whole, but the thing is that their offspring will be not the same as what you have this year. It'll be an inferior quality. You won't know what you're getting because of the two different parent or two different original varieties. And we have up here that the seeds cannot be saved. Well, you can save the seeds and you can try to see what you get, but it will be an inferior quality. It will not be what you have this year. So that's why we say you really shouldn't save those seeds. An heirloom or an open pollinated plant, on the other hand, will have offspring that should have exactly the same characteristics as the previous generation. Those seeds have been passed down from generation to generation to generation. The seeds you save from this are great because you should get exactly what you had this year. Should is the key word. Oh, I forgot to add. If you want to save your seeds, you want to clean and dry them, and then put them in an envelope that's you have the name of the seed or the plant, and you put them in the envelope with silica gel, equal amounts of seed to silica gel. Put them in a jar with a top on it and put them in there for about 2 weeks. After 2 weeks, take them out, take the silica gel out, and return the envelope with the seeds, the labeled envelope with the seeds, back into the jar, and they're ready to go next spring when you're ready to plant them. So you've got your seeds, now you need to prep your garden to go to bed. So you really do need to remove all the dead and diseased plant material. Diseased material left in your plant may overwinter and then affect your new plantings next year. So you really don't want that. You want to get all that diseased material out. Bacteria, fungi, viruses, and nematodes may attack your next crop. So get rid of all of that stuff. Clean, non-diseased material can be composted, such as leaves, shredded newspaper, grass clippings, vegetable peelings, and farm manure. Do not, absolutely do not compost diseased plants, bones, meat scraps, fat, cat or dog manure. Make sure you bag this stuff up and send it to the landfill. You don't want that around your house at all. The next thing to be sure is to pull any weeds. If you've got mature weeds that are in your garden right now, you want to get those out now, because those blooms can hold up to 1,000 to 6,000 seeds. And if you let those seeds get in your garden, you know what will happen. You just don't want to deal with that many weeds next year. You also might have some winter weeds that are showing up right now. I've got some really small ones that are about the size of my little fingernail. And I need to get those out of my garden, because they will overwinter and they will bloom, and they'll be ready to send those seeds out before you're ready to start weeding in the spring. So pull out any weeds. Make sure you've got a good brown cover on your garden. And some people may want to do winter crops. The only two that I know of that are fairly productive are garlic and carrots. I've been really happy with garlic. I did my first planting of garlic last year, and we've got a really good link for growing garlic in Central Oregon. And it talks about when to plant and what you need to do for your soil. And actually right now is when you should be working on the soil for your garlic. And right now is also the time between September and November is when you plant the garlic. It overwinters well, and in the spring the garlic will sprout and it's on its own. It does really well all by itself. There are two types of garlic. One is hardneck and one is softneck. And it's up in the air which one people think are the most flavorful. So you just kind of have to test out and see what's best for your flavor enhancement. Hardneck are the garlic that sends up the bloom in the spring. And when that appears and the bloom is set, you really should cut that bloom off, because you want all of the energy to go into the bulb of the garlic rather than into the bloom. So your garlic head should be bigger. I was at Wilco the other day, and I just happened to notice that they did have some garlic for sale. This is Spanish Roja, and there are 2 garlic bulbs in here. So there's plenty of garlic cloves to plant. So I'll be planting some of this. And because I actually like the hard neck better. It's just a personal choice, like I said. And soft neck is fine. But my pride and joy is this is one of the bulbs that I got from my garden this year. This was a hard neck. You can see it has a very hard piece here. That's where the garlic scape was. Oh, and by the way, the garlic scapes are great if you cut them and saute them. And you can find them actually in the grocery stores in the spring. But so I'm very proud of my garlic. So I'm going ahead again and doing it again this year. Another thing to plant, and that's my experiment this winter. I always like to experiment. I'm doing some winter carrots. So with winter carrots, they should have been planted, the seeds should have been planted at least 4 weeks ago, so they get established. I planted mine about 4 weeks ago. I think they're probably going to be a little bit too immature, but we'll see. I will put some hay mulch around them, and then I will use the row shelter over the top of them, and maybe even a rug to keep the snow off of them, but also to keep the heat in. And we'll see. Carrots are good to about -10 degrees. So hopefully if we don't have too hard a winter, I might get carrots. So I'll have to report back and let you all know, but that's my experiment for this winter. Okay, so we've cleared out our garden beds. Next is compost. So compost is a soil amendment. Don't confuse this with mulch. And Pat will be talking about mulch in her section. Compost is a soil amendment. It's made up of leaves, shredded twigs, kitchen plant scraps, last year's clean garden detritus. And compost actually, it enriches the soil and it increases the water holding ability of the soil. And a good compost looks like a really dark, rich topsoil. It's light and it's crumbly, and it doesn't have large hunks of like bark chips in it. So you can kind of see this picture shows looks like a really good rich compost. Add about 1/4 of an inch to an inch of compost to your per year to your garden bed, and dig it in deep, 8 to 12 inches deep in your existing garden. Compost won't necessarily replace all of your nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. That's the NPK that you see on your fertilizer, but it will add some. So you may have to add additional fertilizer depending upon what you're growing and what your soil needs actually are. And then we can talk about aged manure, because that's also part of compost. There's aged manure, and there's also green manure, also called fresh manure, if you will. That compost that has not been aged. So we're talking chicken, horse, llama, steer, mushrooms. Aged manure, again, a good source of NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, but it more than likely has all been hot composted to over 140 degrees Fahrenheit, which kills the viable weed seeds. You don't have to worry about herbicide pass-through. And at first I was going to say there's no odor, but there is some odor, but it's much less than if you're using fresh manure. And to me, it's easier to buy bagged manure than to try to go and get a truck and all of the extra work. But one thing you need to understand with manure is it takes time to break down. You can put it in your garden, dig it in deep, 8 to 12 inches, but to break it down all of the NPK, it can take up to a year to fully break down. Although aged manure breaks down faster than fresh manure, you're really applying this for the following year. You'll get some benefit for this coming year, but you're looking like 2 years down the road. So an inch, quarter of an inch to an inch added will be good for your garden. So some people might want to do cover crops. Cover crops for a vegetable garden might be a little difficult unless you've got different gardens that you can deal with, because let's just talk about a fall cover crop or a winter cover crop. You need to plant that cover crop at least 4 weeks ahead of a cold snap. So we're going to have a cold snap tonight. It's getting down below the low 30s. 4 weeks ago, that cover crop should have been planted. So it gets established. Well, I'm still harvesting from my vegetable garden. But anyway, some people have other gardens they can deal with. So 4 weeks before a cold snap, it should be planted so that cover crop gets established. And cover crops, there's so many various types of cover crops. You could look on the web and find what exactly each cover crop will do for your soil. And then you have that established. They grow well, they control weeds, they add organic material to your garden, and they're low maintenance. Then when the spring comes, if you're doing a winter or fall cover crop, when that cover crop is blooming, well, you actually need to get it before it blooms because you don't want it to go to seed. You need to dig that into your soil. And if you wait until it's blooming and it's setting seeds, you're going to see that cover crop again. So 3 weeks before you want to plant your garden, you should be digging that cover crop in unless it's blooming. Then you need to dig it in even sooner than that. Again, there's a lot of information on the web about cover crops and what exactly you're looking for your soil. So this is a good one. Planning for next year, which is what we should be doing right now. But we need to look back at what we did, what went right and what went wrong. Keep a paper journal, take photos, label them, date them. There are online options, garden planners. I personally keep a schematic of my garden, so I know where I planted things every year. And I've been doing that for about 8 years now. The good thing about the online options are the planners actually help you position your plants. So you don't plant them or your seedlings or seeds. So you don't plant them too close together. Or if you've been with this online planner for a couple of years, they'll say, oh no, you planted that last year in that place. You need to plant that someplace else. Crop rotation is what that's called. So that's why you keep that information, is because rotating your crops is so very important. It reduces damage from insect pests, and it limits the development of vegetable diseases. And if you look at the picture on your screen of these wonderful looking carrots, this is a perfect example of what I ended up in my garden a few years ago. What went right for me? What was right was my carrots were beautiful. They were great. I loved them. They tasted great. I kept them in the same spot for a few years. What went wrong? That picture is a good example of what went wrong. I pulled my carrots up and they looked ghastly. They were so bad that my carrots were actually sent to Corvallis and taken to the lab so they could diagnose what I had. And it came back that I had nematodes. And that's what happens when you don't rotate your crops. When you rotate, it manages soil fertility because each one of your crops uses your elements a little bit differently. And so it evens out that soil fertility. Rotate your crops, very important. And rotate the plants that are in the same family. So if I have broccoli in one place this year, I will not plant cabbage or cauliflower in that same spot next year. Rotate your crops or you'll end up with carrots that look like mine. Horrible, absolutely horrible. And now Pat will take off and talk about landscape.
Okay, thanks, Joanne.
Yeah.
So now we're going to talk a little bit about what to do with your landscape gardens in the fall, and again, and also talk about how to prepare them for winter. Most of you probably know that early fall is a good time to plant, and it still is early fall, even though we're having some chilly evenings. It still is a good time to plant, divide, and transplant some of your plants. If you plant now, or even a little sooner than this, you need to allow time for the roots of the plants to establish before winter. But you can still, get them into the ground, make sure you give them a little TLC, and they should be fine before winter actually starts. It's also a really nice time to divide your perennials. Usually they're kind of getting a little bit limp now, so to speak, and you can see where you need to divide them, and it's a good time to transplant them, and again to share those transplants or those divisions with other gardeners. Everybody likes to get free plants, and it's a really nice thing to do with other gardeners. It's also really a good time to assess your garden design, kind of like what Joanne was saying, what went right, what went wrong, what do I want to do a little bit differently? Where do I want to plant these plants that I've now divided? And so it's a good time to sit back and sort of look at your overall garden design and decide what you might want to replace. You can gather seed heads, and some of the seed heads are really nice for flower arrangements, and really do look nice as we head into fall. So remember those perennials, things like echinacea has such a nice prominent seed head that they really do look nice in flower arrangements. So you can really, still get some good work done in the garden. I know I was out in my garden a couple of days ago when it was 70 and moved a few things around and transplanted a couple of things. So it's a nice time to do that sort of thing. So, but as the weather gets cooler, as you all know, it really gets time to start doing cleanup, just like in the vegetable garden, except that you're not going to be really tearing things out in a big way like you do when you're harvesting your vegetables. But if you do still have annuals in your actual landscape, now's the time to really start removing them. After tonight and the next few nights, they're not going to look very good anyway. So it's a really good time to remove those annuals. And you do the same thing as you would do with your vegetables. If there's any sort of disease foliage, anything that might have had powdery mildew, or if you've had aphids, make sure that you dispose of that disease foliage in a way that will not infect your garden for subsequent years. So, put them in a bag and take them to the landfill instead of trying to put them in your compost. And then weed. This is one of the things that we all know we have to do. And we all know the weeds are still growing. I just had to pull a dandelion the other day that had a yellow flower on it. So, the weeds are well adapted to our fall. So this is just sort of basic stuff, but you really do need to keep weeding. You can also, if you have planted any dahlias, or if you have gladiolas or calla lilies, now is the time to really dig up and store those tender bulbs. They will not they will not make it through a cold Central Oregon winter. So if you're from some other part of the state and you happen to come on to our webinar, you may be able to, if you're in a warmer section on the west side of the mountains, you might be able to winter over your dahlias. But if you live here in Central Oregon, you're going to need to dig up those bulbs and store them. I did add a link that you'll see that really talks about very specifically how to store these different bulbs. So there's a method to storing dahlias, calla lilies, and gladiolas that's a little bit different, and I don't really have time to go into the detail of each of them, but there is a link that you'll be receiving that should help. Then in late fall, of course, planting the spring blooming bulbs is really a nice thing to do for that early color in the spring. You know, the only thing that I would caution people, if you're new here or a new gardener, planting tulips if you don't have a deer fence or some way to keep deer out is not a really good idea. You know, most of us call tulips deer candy here. So it's really a good idea to plant more deer resistant bulbs like daffodils, etc. You also, now is getting to be the time to really cut back your perennials. There really are a couple of different kinds of perennials. The herbaceous perennials, those are perennials that die completely back to the ground and they reemerge in the spring. So they just die completely back. You can't really even see much that they are even there. Once the frost really turns those tops brown, you cut those perennials back to the ground. Things like hosta, daylilies, peonies, those are the things that are herbaceous and they do die back completely. So as soon as they, you know, they get the hard frost and they're brown, you can cut them all the way back. Then there are semi-herbaceous perennials. They only lose their upper foliage, but they retain what's called the basal foliage, which is close to the ground. With those kind of perennials, you're going to remove the top, the dead tops, but you do want to leave 2 or 3 inches of the actual dead tops, or the, you know, the actual, what was probably a bloom, up, because that does help to insulate the basal foliage a little bit. So leave a little bit up, unless you're leaving a large amount up for the birds. Some people like to leave their perennial flowers up because the birds eat some of the seeds and etc. But in general, if you're not going to do that, just leaving 2 or 3 inches of the perennials up for some insulation is really a good idea. That includes things like Shasta daisies, rudbeckias, echinacea, the penstemon, etc. A word about ornamental grasses. I do see, and this to me, one of the most beautiful things about ornamental grasses are their seed heads. You know, the seed heads emerge, the color is there, they move back and forth in the winter, in the wind, and they add a lot of winter interest. So it really is nice. And of course, it's a personal preference, but to me, leaving your ornamental grasses up in the winter is really a good idea. And then you would prune them in the spring before young shoots appear. And it's kind of a messy job. And I have seen kind of a nice little process that I've seen people use a bungee wrap, you know, a bungee cord, and put it at about 10 or 12 inches above the ground where you're going to actually cut the grasses off. Just tie that bungee wrap around it, and then you would cut the grass off below that. And then the bungee wrap keeps the grasses together, because otherwise they sort of go all over the place and it's sort of a pain to clean up. But you know, to me, and again, it's personal interest, keeping those seed heads and the ornamental grasses up in the winter does add some beauty in the landscape in the winter. A lot of people at this time of year think, well, should I do pruning? You know, what should I prune? Well, basically, you shouldn't prune right now. Pruning is really a late winter or early spring activity for most trees and shrubs. Pruning really stimulates new growth, and this is really not the time of year to stimulate new growth. You know, you want your plants to achieve some dormancy now, and so really it's not a good time to prune any of your plants. In terms of, and of course we could do a full webinar on pruning, but just in general, you want to prune at a time that minimizes the disruption of whatever it is that you're looking at and blooming. So spring flowering shrubs that bloom on last season's growth, you're going to prune after blooming. That would be things like lilacs. So they are going to bloom in early spring. That would not be, you would not prune your lilacs until after they bloom. The things that bloom later, like hydrangea, some spirea, they're going to bloom from the current season's growth. So you're going to prune those in late winter, not now, in late winter. And there is a table in the link that's also on the end of the presentation. You'll get this, that gives you some ideas about when to prune what, because it does get a little confusing sometimes. People wonder, should I prune this now? Should I wait? In general, if something is going to bloom early, you're not going to prune until it's after that flower has bloomed, because otherwise you'll cut off the potential for a bloom. And then those things that bloom late, you're going to prune those in late winter, so that there's a chance for new growth and a new bloom. And then pruning conifers. Generally speaking, you shouldn't have to prune conifers, because if you've planted it in the right place, it's not going to get too big. But we all know that sometimes that doesn't happen. So you may, if there's a branch that needs to be, controlled because it's over the sidewalk, etc., the best thing to do is to prune that conifer when the tree is dormant, from November to February. And that's because when you prune that branch, you're creating a wound, and there's pitch or sap that's going to run. And when you're pruning it at the wrong time, you may end up with an infestation of a pitch moth, which can actually cause lots of damage to the tree. So the best time to prune a conifer would be when the tree is dormant, late winter, early spring. And generally speaking, you really, if a branch is broken and you really see something that needs to be pruned up because there's a broken branch, yes, you would prune that away. You wouldn't wait until spring, until late winter to do that. If there's a broken branch, you would certainly take care of that at any time that you see that. Okay, leaves, pine needles, and too many of both. And I think we're probably all dealing, well, not so much the leaves yet, but I would say that many of us are probably dealing with pine needles right now. And there are lots and lots and lots of them. The best thing for you to do is, particularly with leaves, is to remove the leaves from your lawn and your beds. Leaves do have a way of matting down and preventing water from getting through. So generally, you're going to want to remove the leaves from your beds. They're not something that you want to use as mulch, just because they get so compacted. If the leaves are less than 2 inches and it's dry, you can actually shred leaves using your lawnmower. And if it's not a huge number, a huge amount of leaves, you can actually leave those on your lawn, because they will decompose and just add organic material to your lawn. The pine needles do keep falling, as we know, and pine needles can be used as mulch. They are flammable, so that's one of the things that, from a fire prevention perspective, most of us usually clean up our pine needles and dispose of them, but you can use them as mulch on your beds. They, contrary to popular belief, they do not acidify the soil. Pine needles themselves have a very low pH, but they don't decompose enough to really alter the pH of the soil. So you don't need to worry about that. But both pine needles and leaves can be shredded and used as mulch or added to compost, and are a good addition to compost. But you know, the thing with pine needles is they keep falling. So I know I've raked my yard 2 or 3 times already, and I still have pine needles. So I'm sure that many of you have exactly the same thing. Just like in a vegetable garden, you are going to want to build and amend the soil in your landscape. We know that that amending the soil really does help improve the physical properties of the soil, helps with nutrients, aeration and structure, etc. And just like in a vegetable garden, the compost that you add to your landscape garden needs to be mixed into the soil. You know, you can't just let it lay on top. It will decompose over time, but if you really want to amend the soil, you're going to need to mix it into your soil. Now, most of us, or many of us anyway, have a landscape that's already been established, and it makes it a little harder to add compost into your soil. But you know, putting down 2 or 3 inches and using a rake, and you know, trying to work it into the as far down into the soil as you can, even though you have an established landscape, is a good thing to do. And so you can buy compost in bags. Obviously, you can make your own compost. And as Joanne said, using aged manure in your garden is really a good idea. And then when you're planting, particularly like earlier on when we were talking about dividing and then transplanting, you do want to work some compost into each one of the soil holes as you continue to plant. Now, mulch, on the other hand, mulch is used to reduce evaporation, inhibit weed growth, and moderate the soil temperature. Mulch is left on the soil surface. It's not worked into the soil. Over time, it does break down. So therefore, some mulches are also amendments. But in general, a lot of people add mulch to really just beautify the landscape. And you really should have about 3 inches total of mulch on your ground. Over time, that may build up, but generally speaking, it does break down and it blows away. So you want to kind of go for about 3 inches of mulch when you add mulch to the top of your soil. You can use things like pine bark or bark, pine needles, straw, etc. Lots of people use the wood bark, and that's really obviously helps to beautify the landscape. However, you should add it after the ground freezes. I've seen people adding mulch right now to their landscape, and really what you want to do is you want to wait until the ground is colder, because you want that mulch then to maintain that cold, so that prevents the frost from heat. You prevent frost heaving. If you allow the soil is warm, you add the mulch, it's going to keep it warm. And then as it gets colder, you're going to end up having cold and heat, and it really gives some heaving of frost, to the point where sometimes it'll heave a perennial right out of the ground. So you do want to just try to add your mulch after the ground is really cold or even frozen. When you add the mulch, you should go up to the shoulder of your perennial. You know, don't completely cover the perennials until the ground is actually frozen. And you know, so when you think about the herbaceous perennials that you're cutting all the way back to the ground, those you will cover, but not until after the ground freezes. And in terms of the ones that have a basal foliage, those you're just going to go around the outside of it. And the mulch does help to reduce soil compaction. Things that you can do to protect your landscape in the winter. you know, we know that unfortunately we're in a drought, and hopefully we'll have a snowy winter. But one of the things that really causes a lot of plant loss here in Central Oregon is what's called desiccation. And that's mainly water loss because of lack of precipitation and wind. So it's a very frequent cause of plant loss here. So what you should do, particularly if you have a new landscape, new trees and shrubs, you should water those trees monthly when the temperature is above 40. And we do get some warm winter days, and certainly you can water when the temperature gets to that point. Obviously, you want to try to water midday so that the water will actually soak in. You don't want it to have a big frozen lump of ice around the bottom, the base of your tree. What I've done is, because you don't want to be hauling out your hose either, is take a 5-gallon bucket and drill some holes in the bottom and fill that with water. And then you can place that around your tree so that the water slowly leaks out of the 5-gallon bucket. And then you can move it around to your, you know, to all sides of the tree. And then you know how much water you put down. And then do that, you know, at least monthly, particularly with new landscape, new trees, etc. The other thing that can happen here is called sun scald, which is a southwest exposure winter injury. This low temperature damages the bark of trees, especially in sort of thin bark trees like aspen or birch and young trees. So if you have a newly planted landscape with lots of young trees, you can use a light colored or a white tree wrap, which you would apply, you know, soon now, and then you would remove that in early spring, because you don't want to leave it on all summer long, because it would retain the heat and would cause damage as well. So that's just something to think about if you have either new trees, or if you've taken trees down and now you have a tree that was never exposed to the southwest sun, but now it is because you took down a conifer that was close by. So just kind of be aware of some of those things that can cause damage to your trees. And trees are expensive. You don't want those to, you don't want to lose trees. Snow and ice. This is another one people sometimes ask, okay, we have a heavy snow, and what should I do? Should I remove that snow from my trees and shrubs? Should I just leave it there? Will it help insulate it? Yeah, in some cases, definitely a snow does help insulate the plants, and unless it's really heavy and wet, you probably can leave it on, as long as it's not, you know, super heavy, something that fell off your roof, you know, a big pile of snow that fell off your roof. Those you would want to remove that carefully with a broom. And if you use a snow blower, just, you know, try to avoid trees and shrubs, because that snow coming out of a snow blower comes at quite a bit of velocity and can cause some damage to your trees and your shrubs by that. So you would want to remove snow, unless it's, you know, especially if it's really heavy, wet snow. But if it's ice, you really don't want to remove it. If we get an ice storm, which fortunately we're not really known for too many ice storms, you really want to leave ice on the shrubs and on the trees, because if you try to remove it, it's just going to crack and break. If you have a branch that's really looks like it's bending and it's covered with ice, you can maybe prop up the branch to hold it up so that the heavy ice doesn't cause any damage. But I lived in a part of the country for a while where we had ice storms, and it was absolutely amazing the kind of damage that ice can do to trees and shrubs. I mean, it's devastating, really. So here's some of the links that we've talked about going on: putting your garden to bed, pruning of trees and shrubs, pruning evergreens, choosing a soil amendment, sun scald and sunburn on trees, manure, hybrid versus heirloom, a little more detail about what Joanne was talking about in terms of seeds seed saving, preserving fresh herbs, growing garlic. Lots of good information about growing garlic, if you're interested in that. And then more information about protecting trees and shrubs from winter damage, gardening with mulch. And then this was the one I was talking about in terms of storing those tender bulbs for winter. Information about the difference between storing a dahlia bulb and a gladiola, for example. So that's it. Now I think we are ready for questions. So
Okay, well, I will feed them to you, and I'm going to leave my picture off because the way my glasses work, I have to get really close to the screen, and I don't think I want my face that close to the camera. So
okay.
I just wanted to say also, thank you. Those was excellent. Thank you to both Pat and Joanne.
Thank you.
And Vicki has been answering a few questions in the background. I believe the participants could look at them. If you look under answered questions, they were a little more specific. But I'll go through the questions that have been coming in. We have several. You think that you covered everything, but there's always more. So David asked early on, I have 5 rose bushes planted a year ago. One is a trailing rose, 6 feet high. How do I prepare the roses for winter, especially the trailing rose?
Well,
Pat or
I
Chris?
actually saw that this was a question. So I kind of quickly looked up about it, not really winterizing, but when it's right to prune a trailing rose. And mainly it says after blooming. So, you know, after the trailing rose has bloomed, you can prune it. Now, you know, in terms of how to deal with roses in general, I'm probably not the most expert person on the roses. Does anybody else have any information? I'm sure there's a lot of information out there on trailing roses, but I just quickly looked up while I saw this question, and there is a lot of information out there about what to do. I didn't see anything specifically about preparing it for winter though. So I'm sorry, I don't have the answer to that.
I don't know about trailing roses, but I was just reading about roses because I have some wild roses, and it was suggested that they be cut back to maybe 3 feet, just so the winds don't blow them over and break the branches. But I think what we can do is get some more research on that and send that out to you along when we send the follow-up email, so you'll have that. So
Yeah, that'd be
hope
good.
that helps. Okay, the next question is from Pat, from a Pat, not to Pat, for a perennial garden. Is it best to lay down a light mulch after doing the cleanup and weeding? Which I think you covered, but might want to do a little more on that.
Yeah, but usually with mulching, you want to make sure that you're using about 3 inches for total. So if you have mulch on your garden already, you can look at it, see whether you need to add more. But generally 3 inches, or sometimes even a little bit more, can be added to your garden to provide all the benefits that mulching does. A thin layer of mulch is going to make it look better, but the thicker layer of mulch is going to provide you with all the benefits, like moisture retention, nutrient addition, moderation of soil temperature, that kind of thing.
Excellent, thank you. And Vicki, our person in the background, just said that she found a link on pruning roses, and we'll be adding that to the Q&A answers. So that will be available for everybody.
Right.
And here's some good information. We're talking about dahlias.
Yeah.
Kim says, my dahlias were planted in a large container. I overwintered them in the pot in my garage. I cut back the dead stems in the middle of November, and they came back this year beautifully. Yay.
Yeah, that's great. You know, I think what you did was really sort of mimic what it would be like for those dahlias to be in a little warmer winter environment.
Mhm.
So, you know, I think that's great. I would try it again. I mean, when I went through and looked at all that information, there was a lot of information about taking care of dahlia bulbs. So if you can do it without all that work, I would say go for it.
Yeah. Well, the key thing is that they have to be protected. You can't just leave them in the ground.
Right,
And that's
exactly.
the key. That's the key there.
Right.
Yeah. We do have KPOV podcasts that are that we do every month, And we did one on dahlias, I know because I did it, and there's a lot of information on there on storing it. So on our GoComGo website, and also on KPOV on their archives, you can look at the podcast on that. They'll talk about dahlias and a lot of other information. So now, Joanne, veggies. Diane's asking, in a veggie garden, if there's no cover crop, should mulch or straw be placed on top of the soil? She's got an asparagus bed and a strawberry bed, especially of interest.
It certainly wouldn't hurt to put a straw mulch on, but the important thing to remember is early in spring to get the mulch off so that the strawberries and the asparagus can start their growth and not rot.
But one thing I know about strawberries is that they do have to be protected from cold temperatures. So the best way to do that would be a good heavy mulch of pine needles or straw or something like that. The roots become damaged in strawberries at about 22 degrees. So, and we do get that temperature here frequently.
Easily, yeah.
Thank you, it's excellent. And speaking of frozen, Kim is asking, when is the ground considered frozen? Is it after it snows?
Probably before it snows, actually, I would say.
Well, you can't really tell
Right.
sometimes.
No.
I stick a trowel or something in the ground to see if I can get into the ground. And sometimes, you can get into a small amount like that, but then it begins to freeze down below. So I just test it.
Yeah, there's probably not a freeze date, huh?
Well, I think we might get some of the areas here, we're going to get down to a hard freeze this week. So we might have some frozen ground there.
Yeah, but it won't get deep enough then to
Right.
really
Okay.
consider it until you get several hard freezes.
Right,
Thank you.
right.
I needed that answer. Thank you. Linda is asking about ornamental grasses. Are they included in the perennials that you can divide in the fall?
They should be divided in early spring when the new growth starts to appear. So that's not something you would want to try to divide now. First of all, they're huge and gigantic, but you would do it after you cut it back when you have a clump that you can easily see that you could divide. And it is a good idea to divide those over time, because they do get some of them get very big and they die in the center. And you'll have a kind of section in the center that's really is dead, and you want to probably divide them before you get to that point.
Thank you very much. And here's a question on hostas from Pat. I have 2 hostas in medium-sized barrels. Should I winter them over in the garage, or will they be okay left outside, or would it be best to get them in the ground?
Well, the hostas die back completely and they are very hardy in the ground. And I have some hostas in pots, but I do put them in a covered cloche over the winter. So because they're in a container, they're going to be a lot more susceptible to frozen ground. So I would put them in a protected place if you can do that. Otherwise, you can pack around them pine needles or something like that to help keep that ground frozen. I mean, from freezing.
Yeah, but they're pretty hardy though. They definitely would survive in the.
They survive.
Yeah.
Correct.
They'll survive, especially if they're in the ground.
Thank you. Peggy is asking about hydrangeas. Should I cover them, or will they die? And will they die back completely?
You don't need to cover them. It depends. Hopefully you have a hydrangea that is hardy here in Central Oregon, but they don't die back. You will, depending on the type of hydrangea you have, you may prune it either in early spring or after blooming. And then that really depends upon the type of hydrangea you have, but you don't need to cover them. And they do not die back all the way to the ground.
Thank you.
They look like they're deciduous. They look like a shrub with no leaves on them.
I was thinking there's two examples at the
Right.
demo garden at Holland's Head at the Waterwise Garden. We have a couple hydrangea, and then there's a few of them up at the demo garden in Redmond at OSU Extension. So if you're in those areas, it's often good to look by. I like to go by and say, this is what my plant's supposed to look like. So you might want to see examples of that there.
Right. Good point, Janet.
I like to know what they're supposed to look like. So, okay. Diana's asking about testing soil. When is the best time to test it? And do you have any recommended labs to use?
Well,
Go ahead.
Joanne,
Go ahead.
go for it. No.
Okay.
Of course.
Well, our plant clinic has a list of places for soil testing. Soil testing is not inexpensive though. So you have to consider how much you really want to put into a soil test. If you've got a vegetable garden, you're concerned about a soil test right now would be good, or in the spring before you plant. If you get one now, you will know how to amend your soil in the appropriate way and in what's lacking in your garden. Perennials, probably the soil testing would be the same. But the plant clinic, if you call the OSU Extension office, we do have a list in the office. I don't have one with me. Sorry.
Thank you. Pat is asking, I don't have the best established landscape. Should amending the soil be done every year?
Chris, you want to take that one?
Yeah, the native soil here contains almost no organic material. So if you're working from scratch with a fresh garden, the best thing you can do is initially amend. You want to have about a ratio of 1/3 organic material to 2/3 native soil. So you need to do that initially and then continue probably to amend every year to some degree. Because the plants use up nutrients and organic material in the garden, so you do need to refresh that every year.
Thank you. This is for Joanne. Samantha would like to know if it is much more beneficial to add compost to the veggie garden in the fall than the early spring, and is spring too late to add it?
Spring is not too late to add it, but if you're going to amend your soil, as I said earlier, it takes a while for a compost to break down. So it's best to, if you've got a clean garden for the fall, add it now, dig it in deeply and let it work its magic over the winter. And some of those nutrients will become available for your vegetable garden in the spring. But really, you're looking at a year beyond for it to be totally available. That's why you may need to amend with fertilizer. Depending upon what you're growing, you may need to add more nitrogen. It depends upon what you're growing, but the NPK ratio depends upon what you're growing. But if it were me, I would add some to my garden this fall and dig it in deep.
Thank you. A couple of people are asking about mushrooms. Should I pick the tops of mushrooms that are now growing in the yard and add them to the compost?
That's a good question.
Yeah, it is a good question.
I haven't researched this at all, so this is kind of a top of the head answer here. But if you're talking about mushrooms that appear in your lawn or in your garden, then I would pick those mushrooms as soon as you see them and put them in the trash, not in your compost bin. Because they do put off spores and they spread, and you don't want to incorporate that into your own compost bin, which will then encourage them to crop up elsewhere in your garden. And you don't know really, unless you know about mushrooms, I would be pretty cautious about doing anything with them, and I would put them in your garbage.
Good point.
I believe that we have a mushroom expert in Oregon, and we have the name at the plant clinic, and there's some people that really know which ones are poisonous and which ones are edible.
Yeah, right.
So it might be worth a call if you want to call the plant clinic and get that person's name, get some more information on it.
Janet, do you want to give that plant clinic phone number?
I think I have it on my phone. Hold on.
I have it.
541.
541.
I should have it memorized.
548-6088, and ask when someone answers, you want to ask for the plant clinic. 541-548-6088.
Thank you. Excellent. I should have that memorized, but I don't. Okay, here's Anonymous asking, I have heard that perennials that flower in the summer should not be transplanted until spring, and those that flower early should be transplanted in the fall. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that I've never heard that, for one thing, I guess. And I think probably what they're getting at is that you want to get things transplanted in the time for the roots to get established so that the plant has enough vigor to flower. So, I think saying that some of the flowers in the summer should not be I've never heard that. I think you can transplant a perennial, anytime, really. I mean, you can transplant them in the summer if you want to, but you want to, I don't think that there's any fact to that. How about you, Chris? Have you ever heard
Yeah,
that?
I'd agree. I've never seen that discussed anywhere. And, there's just some kind of general principles you use with transplanting. You don't want to do it in the heat of the summer, because that puts additional stress on the plants. And, a cloudy, cooler days are better than, bright sun, and earlier in the morning or in the early evening are good times and that kind of things. But I've never heard anything relationship to the blooming time.
It's all about root establishment when
Yeah.
you transplant.
Right.
Excellent. Thank you.
Right.
I know that Vicky's answer is in the background, and I've seen a couple of these that we will be sending all these links that we're mentioning out in the email. Will come out in a couple of days. So if you missed it, and I'll put the phone number to the plant clinic in there also. A question came up from Sarah. My dahlias are covered tonight. Are they about to open? Should I keep them covered or cut them and force them to bloom?
Oh, that's a tough one.
I can answer that
The
one.
first thing is you cross your fingers.
Yeah, good luck.
Janet, can you answer that one?
Yeah, actually, I'm becoming a dahlia person, and I'm in a very cold spot. And my dahlias in the backyard all turned black a few weeks ago. That when we had 3 days that were in the 30s. Covering helps. Mine were so tall that I couldn't cover them because the wind would have blown the cover off. So I actually cut all of mine and put them in vases, and I smelled like a florist in my house. So you're gonna have to experiment with it. It's gonna be pretty cold tonight, and they don't like to get down below 30 degrees. So I would cut them and save them, because they don't bloom very well after they freeze. Okay, question on peonies. What is the best way to overwinter peonies? Mine are planted in a raised bed.
Well, peonies should be cut back, and that's part of your cutting back process. And you can do that anytime now. But one thing to remember about peonies is you do not put the peony foliage into your compost bin. It oftentimes harbors diseases, so they're one of those plants that should go in the trash. So anytime you want to cut it back, do so. And I would, just as you would do in the rest of your yard, you would mulch around your peony root area.
Thank you. Somebody is suggesting adding about 8 to 10 inches of mulch to the base of roses for winter. I think that was adding to the discussion we had about
Well, that was
roses.
the question about the, yeah. right.
Yeah, I don't know if you've heard that 8 to 10 inches. I think we were gonna try and find some links for roses. As a 8 to 10 inches as opposed to the usual 3 that we say. In the information on that. We'll see if we can get some more information out in the
Yeah.
email that we answer.
Right. I can answer that question about the potted water plants and the small water feature. You see
Okay,
that question?
no, but go, oh, I see. Oh, yes, I'm sorry. I was scrolled down. Go ahead, answer.
Well, it depends on whether or not you have a perennial a water lily. Like I have water lilies that they are fine. I trim back the leaves because right now they're not sending up many more leaves, and they will actually they will live through ice. My water feature freezes over and they live through ice and they'll come back next year. I think there are some annual water plants. So you kind of need to know whether it was the water lily, a hardy water lily, or whether it's some of the other water plants. But if it's in a pot, generally speaking, I'd say it's probably a hardy water lily or some sort of a grass that would be fine staying in the frozen water over winter.
Thank you.
Yep.
Here is a question on pine cones. Can you run pine cones through a chipper and use that as vegetable garden mulch?
I would, most home chippers that you would have are not going to be strong enough to chip up pine cones. So I would doubt that you would be able to do it. I know I've had some professional chipping done, and they do, put pine cones through that. But they don't really like to do that as well. And so I would not think that that would be a very successful strategy. That's just,
Yeah.
I guess experiment.
yeah.
Joanne,
Yeah.
what do you do to an asparagus bed?
The best thing to do with an asparagus bed, I do not have one myself, so I'm taking this out on the sideline, is just put some good thick straw mulch over the bed. And again, in the spring, make sure that you take it off as soon as you see little sprigs coming up for the spring. Anybody else have a comment?
Oh, that sounds good. Thank you. A question on mulching. Where do you get your mulching products and what do you get? That's all three of you.
Well, there's lots of mulching products out there. I mean, we're really not, you can get mulch at the landfill. They do mulch. You can get, it depends on whether you're talking about compost, but there's lots of companies that provide different types of bark mulch that you can use, and mostly local companies. I've used lots of different ones. I don't know, Chris, what about you?
Yeah, I've used several different ones. One thing you can do is, ask what the content of the mulch is, or the compost is, and find out what that, how that matches with what your goal is for your garden. I think you just also can go and look at it and touch it and feel it and see if it looks like a product that will work in your yard. We don't recommend a specific provider of products, so I would recommend that you talk around, ask questions of experienced gardeners, as well as ask questions of the provider. Getting it from the local nurseries or compost providers here is often more economical, but usually they don't have them available by bags. So you have to, have some means of being able to haul it home.
That also goes along with what Pat and Chris has been saying. Katie Rolls has a comment about she amends her soil with compost from not landfill, but have so much pigweed. What can I do to prevent it? As Chris said, ask questions. Was this hot composted? What temperatures did it get to? The hot compost will, to be a true hot compost, it has to be up to 140 degrees to kill those weeds. So ask questions. What is in your compost? What have you done to make it a mature compost? And if you've got pigweed now, the only thing I can say, unfortunately, is you just need to pull it. Pull it as it comes up. Hope that helps.
Well, on that depressing note, ask questions and make sure you rotate your carrots.
True.
So, here's an easier question. Which types of plants in my vegetable garden can be brought in during the winter and replanted next spring?
Okay, well, let's be honest. Vegetable plants are annuals. They're not perennials. So you more than likely will not be able to bring anything indoors and then replant it next year, because it's an annual. It is to live 1 year and that's it. It's a quick life. So you can try your best at bringing something in, but I wouldn't expect a good follow-up on it.
Thank you. And this is just a comment. I wish I'd seen this earlier about hostas. If the person that was asking about hostas is still on, Sarah says, I have hostas in raised barrels and beds, and they have some protection, but they come back huge every year.
Good.
Yeah, they're pretty hardy.
Hostas like Central Oregon.
As long as the deer don't get them,
Exactly.
they're in great shape.
Another deer candy.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Oh, well. I have a lot of that in my yard. Liza is asking, I have a large Grosso lavender plant, 3 by 3, which I guess 3 foot by 3 foot. And there are areas, especially in the middle of the plant, that have died. Is that normal, or is there anything I can do to stop that?
Yeah. Chris, you want to take that one?
I don't really know the answer to that one. So if anybody else has got it, my suspicion is that may be a natural habit of the lavender, and that that's just part of their life cycle, and that there's not much you can do about it except annually prune your lavender as appropriate.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Sorry about that.
And we prune it now, or we do it in the spring? I guess it depends if you want to leave it for the birds. I saw there's a lavender farm out in I don't know, on the way to Tumalo, and they're pruning all of their lavender right now.
Mm-hmm.
You can prune either spring or fall.
Okay. Samantha says, I have an aster and a penstemon that I want to move in my garden. Is now the best time, or should I do it in the spring?
It's too late now.
Yeah, I think I would wait until spring now, even though I just transplanted a couple of things.
Yeah. The weather's going to be down to 30, low 30s, and as before, your roots are not going to be established well enough.
And the forecast is for very cold nights in the next week or so. So I would not, unless you absolutely have to transplant anything more, and wait till the spring. Besides, your asters are probably still in bloom. So I'd enjoy those and wait till next spring.
Thank you. I only have a few more questions. One is, what is the best advice for growing peonies in Central Oregon?
Peonies do great here.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a good environment for growing peonies. You know, I think that they're relatively easy to grow. They do get root weevil, but what about you, Chris? I mean, I found that I was able to grow them, and I'm, you know, I always have problems with things.
Yeah. I don't have a lot of experience at all with peonies, but I have seen some fabulous ones here. I do know that they definitely like full sun, so you need to choose your location pretty carefully about where you plant them,
Speaking of peonies, and I was thinking this very same thing because I have the same problem. Someone says, "How do you get rid of those root weevils on
No,
peonies?"
and I said, why did I mention root weevils?
Seems like we've been dealing with that recently.
Yeah.
Janet, you have good
come on,
experience with
Janet.
root weevils.
You know, yes, we have those on some other plants I have them on my peonies, and we have them on lilacs and some other plants in the water wise. And the best
Right.
thing to do is to buy live nematodes. They're beneficial nematodes that you can get from the local nurseries here. You can also order them online. And make sure they're specific for root weevils, and you put them in twice a year. One is right about now. It might be the ground's a little too cold now. The ground needs to be about 45 degrees, but you can take a soil thermometer and make sure it doesn't get that cold. And you put them in like around October, late September, October, and again in the spring when it warms up, and the nematodes eat the root weevils. So it might take a couple of seasons to do it. Got frustrated. I was trying to look for some poison that would do it, and there really wasn't anything, you know. Seems to be the way to do it.
How do you know that you have root weevils?
Oh, leaves get those little notch edges, and my peony has it. I inherited it when I bought this house, and I went, so that's what a peony looks like. I thought that was what the leaves look like, but and you see them all over town. You'll recognize them. There's little notched where the weevils come out at night and they eat the leaves.
Right.
So beneficial nematodes.
Right.
Okay,
But,
so
you know, the reputation is that root weevils are difficult to get rid of. So,
well, and they say you can also go out at night and actually rub them off with the leaves, you know, if you're a night person. I haven't done that yet. I like to be inside at night. Oh, here's a question. I don't know about this plant. I have a very fussy Daphne that will spend her first winter in the ground this year. Anything special I should do? And it just went flying. Anything special I do to protect it?
Is it a rock Daphne? I mean, I'm assuming that it's the shrub that's a rock Daphne.
We'd have to have this person jump right back in.
Yeah, anyway,
Microphone's
you know,
off.
I don't know if there would, I mean, it's a shrub. I guess if it's, one thing I would do is make sure that doesn't get desiccated, that it gets enough water. You know, if it's a really dry, just when we were talking about, you know, how that causes a lot of failure in trees and shrubs. So if it's a little bit fussy, you know, I would probably give it a little TLC over the winter with making sure that it gets enough water. But it should be a hardy shrub. I mean, they certainly are here, but I know they do have a reputation for being a little bit difficult too, though. So I guess that's probably one thing I would do is make sure it gets enough water.
yeah,
You know,
I mean, it's a new transplant.
Right.
So water is essential for new transplants. And I would also recommend you mulch it pretty thickly to make sure that its roots are protected.
Right. Right. See, the dahlia lady went out front and cut her dahlias.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fingers crossed, that's me.
Nobody said they went out and picked their tomatoes.
Yeah, that's good. Good.
They didn't
You go, Pine.
I just want you to know that Vicky in the background has, if the lavender person is still here, that Vicky did some research on the gross lavender and that it is the normal life cycle, normal, and that they do have a life cycle. Prune the spent blooms now just to the end of the blooms. So now we all learned something on that.
Yeah. Thanks, Vicky.
Let's see, why a couple more. Why would a mugo pine have some brown patches? Would this be a watering issue or a pest issue?
Boy. It's kind of hard to know without seeing it, you know, what. I don't know.
Because mugos don't necessarily have the annual dieback that ponderosas have. So,
Right.
you know, you'd have to investigate the needles to see if there were any pests that you can see. You might even need to use a microscope to see. But it also could be a watering issue. It could be a desiccation issue.
And you can bring that into the plant clinic. We get a lot of those questions there. We have somebody there every day from 9 to 1. I'm not sure, we're going to go for a couple more weeks, I think, but we've got people that will go do research and see research that's been done on it already, and sometimes have you send in a picture or bring in a sample of it. And it's kind of hard to answer that without seeing the specifics of it.
Yeah, but a call to the plant clinic would be in order for sure.
Yeah.
The last one we had, there were a few questions about Russian sage. When should it be cut back and how low should it be cut back?
So
Well,
I have
You
Russian
have
sage.
Russian sage, don't you?
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think,
Joanne.
well, I have quite a few Russian sage because they seem to what's the word I'm looking for? Send out their own seeds.
Yes, they do. Lots of
Proliferate.
volunteers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Volunteers. Got quite a few of them, but I leave them up during the winter for just the look of them. You can cut them back now if you want, but they are good for, you know, birds to get some of the seeds, and leave them until the springtime and cut them back to what, maybe 5 inches.
As far back as you can, really.
Okay, I leave
You
mine
know.
up, but yeah, okay.
Yeah. I cut mine back because mine start breaking off and look messy. So,
Yeah.
but
I have always tended to not prune mine until just before bud break in the spring.
And I've had mine just prune themselves all the way to the ground and they come back with a vengeance. They're very happy here.
right.
I'm with Pat. Mine are pretty much about when bud break and then prune.
Right. That was, I thought we were done, but here's one more
hellebores.
question. I think we're going to wind it up. Just Mimi, one of our master gardeners, popped in and said she thought plant clinic is now closed, which is maybe, but the number is still monitored, and I think Tony will answer questions as they come in. So thank you, Mimi. And one more question is when to prune hellebores.
I just leave mine after mine bloom. There's foliage. I leave the foliage and they'll die back just like other perennials. So when we get the hard freeze, they're going to die back to the ground and you're not going to see them until they come up in the spring.
Right.
So, you know, right now mine look pretty good. I mean, the foliage is still really very nice. So I probably won't do anything to mine until they look, you know, till they get really frosted, and then I'll trim them off. So you can leave the foliage though after the bloom. The foliage is nice.
Thank you. That okay, things are popping in, but they're saying
Yep, thank you. Lots of thanks.
great information, and thank you, and you're very welcome.
Thank you.
Happy that everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you,
all
guys.
for.
Oh, and we need to do the survey. So don't
Yes, well-
sign off, everybody.
What will happen when you log off, the survey will pop up on your screen. So it's not something we generate from here. And I'll probably send another link to it on the answer. We will be sending out all the links and a link to the recording that you'll be able to share with people if you want. That'll come out in about a couple of days once it's being recorded on Zoom. And then we'll have a link to the recording on our website also. I guess I could put my picture back on, huh?
Yeah.
Oh, here I am. Now that I'm not reading. Anyway, thank you all for attending, and Someone's asking if we have a date for next year's seminar. We don't, but we will get the word out, and we do. One of the questions on the survey is what classes are you interested in? And I think next year we're going to be doing a lot of Zoom classes. So thank you very much. Everyone have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you at the next class.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you all.
presenters.
Thanks, everybody.
All right.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.